Great. I'm Matthew Spangler. I'm a professor in the Performance Studies program in the Communication Studies department. And we're really honored today to have Christy Lefteri visiting us in this conversation from London. Christy, thank you for being here.
Hi, well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here with you guys.
Christy is the author of a beautiful novel called The Beekeeper of Aleppo, which I have the American version of here in my hand. I say the American version because the UK version has a different cover photo. Yeah. It's an incredible book published in 2019 about two Syrian refugees traveling from Aleppo to the UK. The book has won a number of awards. It won the Aspen Words Award in 2020, and also the Dayton, it was a runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Fiction, which is also an incredible award. Christy also teaches creative writing at Brunel University in London, and we're thrilled to have her with us today. Thank you. I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to a discussion from the broader group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds good.
Christy, you've been asked this question a number of times in the past, and so I'm sure you have an elaborate answer for this, but tell us about the process of writing this book. I know that you did a lot of research for it, on the ground research. Can you tell us about the whole process from the start to the finish?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the very first thing that's important for me to mention is that my parents were also refugees, which was initially the thing that got me interested in volunteering in the first place. So I'll tell you a little bit about that first, and then I'll go on to my experience of working at the refugee centre, because I think that part of my research, or just that part of my background, is important to the overall, I don't know, I suppose how it all came together. So my parents were refugees became refugees because of the war in Cyprus in 1974, when the island was divided. And my dad was a commanding officer of that war. My mum was a refugee, and a lot of my family members, so it wasn't just my mum and dad, which were left homeless after that, after the war. Because my dad was a commanding officer, I think he was quite traumatized by his experiences, but we never really spoke about it. I'll go into that a little bit later on if I have the chance. But he had to kind of at the end of the war, he traveled through Europe, and he had to eat fruit off the trees in France in order to get to the UK. And so there was this whole journey that he made, and my mum made a different journey, and my other family members made a different journey. And sometimes I'd hear little tiny bits of it, but the thing is, it was always there. The war and that sense of displacement was always there, like a shadow in the background that wasn't spoken about, but you could see it in people's reactions and the way that they lived. And yes, there were many negative things, but there were also positive aspects to it as well. And I could always see how hard they were trying to integrate, but at the same time, how frightening that was. So sometimes the Greek Cypriot community in London would sort of shut itself in, and which is something that I think naturally happens, especially when people become refugees and they end up in a place that they don't know, with a language they don't really know, people around them that they don't know, and as well as all the loss that they've experienced and the trauma. So this was the world that I was kind of born into. So it became very much part of who I was and my identity, I guess. And then, so what happened was that my dad moved up, after my mum died, my dad moved back to Cyprus. So my mum died in 2008, and then a few years after that, he moved back to Cyprus. And in the spring of 2016, I went to visit him, as I do, quite often. But this particular year, I just I felt something different, because I remember, because my dad lives on the far east side of Cyprus that faces Syria. So I remember sitting on that shore, and it's a really pretty beach, and the sea was sparkly. There were hardly any tourists there because it was Easter, not summer. If it was summer, I wouldn't have been able to walk without stepping on somebody's head. But it was Easter time, so it was it was just empty, and I was just sitting there. And I really got this thought into my head that if I'd got on a little boat and traveled for about an hour, I would have ended up in Syria, and what a different situation I would find. And that thought was just going round and round in my head. And then I started imagining things, you know, because I'd been watching all this on the news. But being so close, that proximity, that kind of sense that, you know, I remember at one time being really quiet and thinking, would I be able to hear a bomb? I mean, that's how close it felt to me. And I felt really lucky that I was sitting on the beach that I was sitting on. And I started thinking about the children and the families, and how afraid people must be, and how safe I was in comparison. And then suddenly I was thinking about 1974, and I wondered, like, in Syria, were people looking out across the sea and thinking something similar to what I was thinking many years later, and wondering what the people in Cyprus were feeling and how frightening it was for them. And it was that thought that made me kind of think, oh, I just want to do something. I just want to help in some way. But obviously I couldn't go to Syria. So I thought, well, what can I do? And I speak Greek. So I knew that so many people were passing through Greece. And so I decided to investigate and see if I could volunteer. And initially I wanted to go to one of the islands, and I rang up some organizations, but eventually I was directed to this particular center. It's called the Hope Center in Athens, because they said that there were obviously they could do with more volunteers on the islands, but they were really desperate for people in Athens, because what was happening was people were coming off the islands and going into Athens, and so it was becoming so overcrowded in Athens, and there weren't enough volunteers. So anyway, I ended up in a center called the Hope Center, which is basically a center just for women and children that live in the camps. So nearby, there were 3 main camps. There were others a bit further on, but nearby there were 3 main ones. It was Elinigo, which was the old airport, which was just full of tents. There was the old school, which was an abandoned school that had been turned into a campsite. And so you'd recognize, if you've read Beekeeper, you'll recognize the old school, the one where Nuri and Afra, they go there, but they have to be sent away because they don't have a child with them. So only families were allowed to stay at the old school, which made it a much nicer environment to be in. It felt safer there, but also it was really unfortunate for people that really were vulnerable and needed somewhere safe, but had to be turned away because they weren't a family with children. And then there was the worst place of all, which was Bedion-Douareos, which you'll recognize again from my story, which is the park in the middle of that Athens that had been turned into a campsite. So people would come from those camps to the center, and the center was a really safe place for them. We had an area for new mothers, like mothers that had literally just given birth. So the babies had either been born on the journey or in Athens. There was a play area for children. There were showers, and there was a tin biscuit area. And I would rotate. So sometimes I was on shower duty. Sometimes I was in the place area. Sometimes I was with the new mothers, like holding their babies while they had a shower, helping them to change the babies, or I don't know, just sitting with them. Like there was this one woman who, for example, was so traumatized. I don't know what she experienced. She wouldn't talk, but she was so traumatized that she could talk, but she just was very quiet. She was very beautiful. I remember her really clearly. And she couldn't produce any milk, and the baby wouldn't take any formula, only a little bit of formula. So we all started getting really worried that the baby might not survive. It was so tiny. He was so tiny. I actually named Afra after him. So he had the male version of the name Afra. And anyway, so all we could do really was sit with the mother, and we didn't have a food license, so we'd offer her tea and biscuits. We'd make sure that in the evening she'd go to the right place where she could get food. But we just sit with her. And I remember, just if I was making her tea, I'd put loads of milk in it because it was more nutritious. Just little things like that, and just sitting with her. And I just remember carrying the baby quite a lot while she was having a shower, which was a huge thing for her to give us the baby to hold, you know. I just remember holding that little baby and singing, and then her coming out with a shower. Like, I'll never forget these little things. Sometimes they give me goosebumps when I think about them, because I think, where is that little boy now? He's going to be about 3 or 4 now, and where is he? And I hope they're still not in the camps, and I really hope they've settled. And so her husband used to wait outside for her and just drop her off with the baby and not leave. He would just sit there on the step outside and not leave. And that just told me so much about people, and like love and separation. And, you know, he just wouldn't leave. He would just sit there outside all day. And anyway, I've kind of lost my trail of thought. But so being at the center, being there, and there were so many stories I could tell you. But just being there was so eye-opening and overwhelming and exhausting, because I've told you like these little memories, but there was lots of just sort of whizzing around. And then I went back the following year, and the following year it had turned into an activity center rather than a drop-in center. So I was teaching English then, and also there was something there about me being able to see like how much that center had progressed, and therefore how much people had this desire to progress. And so the women there were learning German, English, Greek. There was one girl there that I'd met the year before who was more fluent in Greek than I was by the time I'd come back. And all she could say the previous year was "I love you" in Greek, which is "Sagabot." So I was sort of in awe of how these people had experienced so much trauma, and yet they had so much energy to learn and try and continue living and continue learning and continue growing. And so I guess all of those emotions and many more made me really, really not be able to not write. Like I just felt like I had to write.
Christy, I take it from this description. So these visits were in 2016. That was the first larger one. And then the visit back was in 2017, at a time when a lot of Syrians were coming to Europe as refugees. And I take it from your description here that you didn't start with the idea that you would write a book about this. This was a sort of separate thing for you. And the book came later. Do I understand that right?
Yeah. So I was there, and what happened was so I went because I wanted to volunteer. And then while I was there, I started to get so overwhelmed with emotion that I thought, maybe I might want to write about this, because that has been my reaction always. Whenever I've been overwhelmed since I was young, my response has always been just write something. And so I kept getting this scene in my head of this husband and this wife, and they were in a crumbling house. And oh my God, I've just realized that my laptop is not on the charge, and it's going to go dead. So can you just 1 second? 1 second. I'm really sorry. I should have realized that before. Please don't die.
It's all good for our viewers who might be coming to this topic for the first time. The Syrian Civil War sort of officially started in 2011, and people left in smaller numbers starting then, but then the larger refugee numbers started around 2015, 2016, and they continue today. Syria leads the world as the nation that has produced the largest number of refugees. For many decades, it was Afghanistan, but in recent years, Afghanistan has been overtaken by Syria. So we're talking about millions of people, who have been displaced as a result of that civil war. Can you tell us a little bit about the reception of the book? I mean, were you, as I said in my introduction here, it's won a number of awards. It's been on the bestseller list in England for 2 years now. Were you surprised? I mean, you must have been. Any writer who writes a book is but what is your response to the overall reception
Oh my God, I mean, I
of
was
this novel?
completely surprised. I wrote the book full of emotion, and for the people that I had met, and also for what my parents had at some point in their lives been through, and my family, and that thought I had, especially the thought that the children that were at the center. And I kept thinking when I came back to the UK, like, what about the children that didn't make it there? And what about the people that didn't make it there? And the fact that I kept thinking about it all the time. So I kind of poured it all into the story, not thinking where it was gonna. I don't even think I knew where the story was going. I mean, when I'm writing, I never really know where the story's going. And in the meantime, I was having Arabic lessons with my tutor Ibrahim. And then when I told him I was writing the manuscript, we were doing 45 minutes of Arabic lessons, which I don't remember anything of, by the way, and then 45 minutes of reading the manuscript so that he could help me with all the Syria bits. And I kept wanting to give up, and he was like, no, keep writing this, keep writing it. And then it was hard for him as well because of all the discussions we had. And so during all that, I don't know what I was thinking. I just thought, I'm just writing this and I'm learning so much, and it's horrific. And then I don't know, and then suddenly it, I mean, the publishers bought it and everything, and I could see, like, everyone that was reading it was suddenly really emotional. And I remember thinking, well, I've somehow infused this book with my emotions, and people are connecting with that. It's almost like whatever I felt, I don't know, it sounds a bit weird, this might sound a bit corny, but it almost felt like holding hands with people. Like when I knew that people were reading it, it almost felt like holding hands with people. I know that sounds a bit weird, or a bit corny, but that was the feeling I had. Like, oh, there was just something really, I can't think of the word, humbling about it. I don't know if that's the right word. Just something like, I don't know, just something that really connected me with my emotions and what it feels like to be connected with other people in the same emotions. And then suddenly it was a bestseller, and then it continued to be. So I think, I don't know really what I feel about that. I just feel a bit like, oh my God, so many people are reading it. Gosh.
This is my last question for you, and then we'll open it to a broader discussion. We have other people also on this call. As you say, the book is so full of emotion. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. I think it's very moving for many readers. And this has been a topic not only with Syria, but other countries too. I mean, we live in an age where more people are displaced today than ever in human history. About 1 in 100 people on the planet have been forcibly displaced from their homes. And we often talk about that as a sort of statistic or something in the media. I mean, what you do in this book, obviously, is you sort of put an emotional face and a real human sense into this story. I mean, somebody might see that as being an advocate in some ways for refugees. Did you think about the book that way at all when you were writing it, or have you thought about it since? How do you respond to that this book in some ways is advocating for a kind of human angle on a topic that many of us understand as a statistic and a number?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I was thinking about it while I was writing, but I do remember having the thought of, whoever reads this book, I hope that they can, it's like linked to my previous answer, I hope that they can see what I saw, kind of thing. And I hope that they can walk in my character's shoes and feel what these characters are feeling. And then after, when I realized the impact it was having, then yes, I did hope that the book could become more and more of an advocate for refugees. because I think what happens on the news, because when I came back from volunteering, I remember I spoke to a friend of mine. I said, gosh, you know, it's really opened my eyes. I said to her, I can't believe what I saw and what I felt. And she said, well, what's unbelievable? She said, didn't you used to watch it on the news? So the news is full of like sort of crisis imagery and unspecific, you know, sort of, you know, there's no humans necessarily in the news articles, and we lose that connection. And I remember feeling such a distance when I was reading those news articles. It wasn't listening to the news or reading news articles that made me want to go and volunteer. It was sitting at that beach and thinking about my parents. So it was an entirely different thing that got me volunteering. The news articles or watching the news was sort of slightly going over my head. I couldn't really absorb it properly. So when my friend said that to me, I was like, well, no, you know, it's just different. So I guess reading, you know, there's something about reading and something about allowing ourselves to walk in the shoes of certain characters that I think can bring these stories to life in a different way, whether it's a piece of fiction or a memoir, or because there's also people who are refugees themselves who are writing poetry, memoirs. Even on my website, we started collecting stories from refugees in Thessaloniki at the Open Cultural Centre, where they could tell their own stories. So there's different means of hearing these human stories, but I think the news left me feeling a bit cold.
Mm-hmm. Why did you choose the format of fiction? I mean, you surely must have thought at some point about other more documentary formats, oral history, something of that nature. But this is a work of fiction. What went into the thought process behind that?
It gave me freedom to, I mean, I always only wanted to write fiction, really, apart from some newspaper articles that I've written. But so that's the first reason. I just wanted to write fiction. But it's also, it gives you freedom to think about what you're creating and how you're going to create it so that it has the most impact. So the previous question that you asked me, like, was I thinking about this? Well, I didn't necessarily think, oh, I wanted this book to be an advocate, but I knew that I wanted my reader to be able to walk in my character's shoes and feel something. So that was my sort of aim while I was writing, I suppose, whether it was conscious or unconscious. So then I think if it's a work of fiction, then you can mold it, and you're not restricted by, how am I going to say this? You are restricted by reality, because what I wanted was to portray an emotional truth, but you're not restricted by by the movements of a real life story, so that you can then mold your own story in order to reflect an emotional reality rather than, I don't know, a series of events, for example. So you can, there's a lot more freedom. So that's what I wanted to be able to do.
At this point, I'd like to open it to a broader discussion. I don't think in the recording that you can see that there are other people on this call, but there are. And so if you all have questions, I'll watch the screen here and I can call on you, or you can raise the little yellow hand, whichever you prefer. It strikes me, Christy, and hearing you say that, that in some ways fiction, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, but in some ways fiction has the capacity to get closer to the truth than other more documentary, quote unquote, methods, because fiction can sort of tell the story of a truth without having to hew to the specific details of something.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I actually think that's true.
Nick, I see your hand up. Yeah.
Thanks. So Matt mentioned that I direct the Steinbeck Center here at San Jose State. And so I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years thinking about Steinbeck and reading not only his work, but also the journals that he kept while he was working. And one of them is a journal that he kept while he was writing The Grapes of Wrath. And it was published under the title Working Days. And I was struck by the similarities between your process for writing this book and his. You know, he went to a refugee camp in near Bakersfield, California, a place called Arvin, where he spent time with the refugees from the Dust Bowl area of the United States who were looking for work. And one of the things that he wrote about a lot in this journal is how worried he was that he wouldn't be able to get their story right, and that he wouldn't do them justice, or he wouldn't do their experience justice in his book. And it wasn't just a passing worry he had. I mean, he was really, really worried about this and wrote about it frequently in this journal. So I wanted to ask, did you ever feel any of that with respect to the subjects who you were thinking about while writing?
Absolutely. And I really want to read that journal now that you've mentioned it. That's really sounds fascinating. I haven't read any of his journals, so
I'll send you the name. I think it's in print, and Penguin publishes all his stuff. So
okay, yeah, please do. Yeah, that would be brilliant. Yeah, I mean that's a really familiar feeling to me. And the when I felt it the most was when I was reading Ibrahim, the manuscript. So I remember we'd meet up at Euston Station. Well, at first it was in East Finchley, and then it was at Euston Station in the Café Rouge there. And I'd be reading him the manuscript, and I'd be like, Ibrahim, am I getting this right? I mean, am I, because he's the only one at that time, he was the only one I could ask. So all my questions kind of fell on him, and all my anxieties about what was I doing, and how could I capture this, and so it was something that was really, I was preoccupied with. Actually, it was something that was very much part of my mind and kind of part of the process, this constant doubt that I had. But then the way I used to deal with it was, it's actually linked to the previous question about fiction, and kind of, it was that idea of keeping myself grounded in that emotional truth. And I thought, well, and I kept reminding myself, like, I'm not writing anybody's story, I'm not telling anybody's story, but what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get across something I felt, that I felt from others, and that I also felt from my parents, and something that's a very human emotion, and something to, at that time it was all sort of floating around in my head, something to do with displacement, something to do with horror, something to do with life and hope and love, and what relationships mean, and how we treat those closest to us when we're suffering from so much trauma. Like, for example, the men that were sitting outside, and they wouldn't leave. It wasn't just that guy, there were other men too. And then there was this other man who sat outside. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He held a picture of his mother and his two brothers, and he lost his voice. He couldn't speak, and he was cutting his wrists. So he was communicating in a different way. And it was like remembering all those things and thinking about all those emotions and staying connected with them, and just trying to get that into the story. And so it was a way of helping me to kind of not be so hard on myself and think, oh, how am I going to tell this story? I thought, let me just remain connected to the emotions that I felt, or that I thought I saw, or that I thought I heard about, and just remain connected. That was the only way I could deal with it, because it was a preoccupation that I had. I love that question. No one's ever asked me that before. So thanks for asking it.
Thanks for your answer.
Yeah, Victoria.
Hi, Christy. Thanks for being here. This is super
Hi.
interesting. Well, I'm struck by something. This is kind of a detail in the book, but because of what you've mentioned a couple of times with these men waiting for their wives, for their spouses, their mothers, whatever it is. One thing I was really struck by in the book, and I wanted to ask you why you set it up this way, because I'm sure it was intentional, is how Nuri leaves Afra. You just see him leaving her all the time. And I almost had anxiety reading the book. I was like, don't leave her. Don't leave her in the park. Don't leave her in that room. I mean, you sort of know that's going to be the worst moment he leaves her. And he wakes up in the closet. He wakes up in the courtyard. He wakes up in these strange places. And you realize as the book unfolds, it's partly because of his PTSD and trauma that he can't sleep, et cetera. But this idea of leaving her when they're both so vulnerable and they're both in such a terrible place you want to see them drawing on each other for strength, but it's almost like the opposite happens. So I wanted to ask you about that and how that kind of physical part of how they interact in the world and with this very vulnerable situation they're in related to your understanding of how they were figuring out their way through the internal difficulty they had experienced.
That's another really interesting question that I've never been asked before. I really like your questions today. I think that kind of originated from what I saw within my family and also the men that you mentioned. Because I think what happened with my dad, for example, is he became hyper vigilant and overprotective. So in a way, he was so present that sometimes it was too much. But at the same time, he'd sort of turn away and you'd feel sort of and get angry with that turning away and get lost somewhere in his own mind, that there'd be this sort of like, I remember this feeling and I never knew how to place it or what it meant, but he would do it with anger. So he'd turn away with anger. And I'm absolutely sure this was from the trauma of the war, because having spoken to him once the Beekeeper was going to come out and I was writing an article about transgenerational trauma and about how trauma can be transferred from one generation to the next. And I was having a conversation with my dad about this, and he suddenly opened up about the war for the first time ever and told me that even over 40 years later, he's thinking about the war on a weekly basis. So at the time, he must have been drowning in it. And I remember this sort of very, very present dad, and then this dad who would get so angry that he'd turn away with that anger and you'd kind of feel abandoned by him. And you didn't know where you were in that. And that was my dad's way of dealing with it. And I'm sure other people have their own ways of dealing with it. But it kind of left me, especially later when I went into therapy and, you know, I became interested in psychoanalysis and it sort of left me with this feeling, this question of, why is it that when we're the most traumatized or the most kind of devastated in our lives, sometimes it's the people we love the most that we kind of treat maybe the worst sometimes. And I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, because I don't think it's intentional, but I guess what my dad was doing, he was playing something out. Perhaps at the times when he was angry, he was remembering something and he had to withdraw and switch off. And in a way, that's similar to what's happening with Nuri. He's there with Afra, he's dressing her. He looks into her eyes, he kind of wants to see if she can see. And he's very protective over her. And then he sort of withdraws and he's in the garden, or he's in the cupboard, or he's, towards the end where he's, walking into the sea. So I think originally the idea of that, and I'm not even sure how conscious it was, came from what I saw with family members that were kind of, I suppose, trying to come through and survive their own traumas, and how that played out in relationships.
That's super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, Amna.
So my question is more to do with the creativity of writing it all. So particularly, I was very interested in Muhammad's character. So the question is, so Muhammad sort of like arrives on the scene in Istanbul, but then he is lost in Liros. So why does it stop there? Why doesn't the hallucination continue on to Athens? Why does it stop particularly in Liros? I mean, it for me, it was like, I don't know how to articulate this, because I thought that he would continue on to Athens, but then he didn't. But then he reappears again in England.
I don't know. That's my honest answer. I don't know. And again, no one's ever asked me that before. I actually don't know. And that's the first time I've kind of thought, okay, well, why did he disappear in Liros? I don't know. I'm not really sure. I'd have to go back to that section and reread it to have a think about what I was feeling at the time and why I felt that at that moment something had become almost overwhelming, I suppose, for Nuri. I'd have to go back to those pages because I can't remember what my thought process was. And then all I'd be able to do is tell you what my thought process was and how it might have led to that decision. But I can't actually remember off the top of my head why. But I guess my answer is there isn't in my mind a solid reason for that. It must have been something to do with something I felt about the characters and their journeys while I was in that section, while I was writing that section.
For those listening to this who maybe haven't read the book, Muhammad is a boy. He's 8, right? Do I have the age right, Christy? He's 8 years old, and he joins the two main characters on their journey in Istanbul. He's a Syrian boy who has no parents, or his parents aren't there, they're gone. And he joins the two main characters on their journey in Istanbul. But he doesn't go through the whole journey, as the question here is pointing out. He disappears. I don't want to say too much more about him for people who haven't read the book. He turns out to be a very significant character to the story. Good. Yeah, Natalie.
I was super curious about the form of the novel. I really loved how in the present day sections, when they were in England, every final sentence would break off in the middle of a word, and then the word would be the chapter title for the next section, the flashback, and it would lead into that flashback. And I was just super fascinated with that because it wasn't something I'd ever seen before, and I really loved it. So I'm curious to know how you, created that.
Well, so first of all, I created the novel that I initially created was linear. So it started in Syria and it ended in the UK. And then I realized that I didn't want it to be linear because the thread of the story wasn't necessarily, do they make it to the UK? The real point of the story was, do they manage to find a way to love each other again? Which is sort of linked to, in a way, Victoria's question earlier about why Nuri leaves Afra all the time. So the real thread, or in my mind, the forward-moving energy of the story is do they manage to be able to connect again in a way that's not sort of so I guess adding to their traumas. So that when I had that thought, I changed the structure. So what I did is I got the UK bits and I started to kind of intersperse them. So I got so I started to restructure it so that Nuri and Afra were in the UK first, and then they were in Syria, and then back in the UK, and then they were in Syria, and then back in the UK, and then in Turkey. So I started doing that, and I thought to myself, what I really want is to show how Nuri is getting sort of sucked back into these memories. And the way that I came up with that idea of having that word that kind of joins the past, the present with the past, is basically after my mum died, I remember like missing her so much that I'd be having a conversation with someone and then they might say something like, I don't know, blah, 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 do you want a cup of tea or something? Let's say the word tea. And then that word tea would just sort of throw me out of the place that I was. And suddenly I was somewhere else in my mind, having a tea with my mum or sitting in a cafe, having a cup of tea with her, because we loved having cups of teas or cups of coffee together. And there I was. And the memory that often came back was during this time when we went to this cafe called Chocochino's, and she just had her first chemo session and she just wanted fries. She was absolutely craving fries. So we both had a cup of tea and some fries. And then when anyone mentioned tea, I would then go back, I would kind of sort of fly back to that memory. And then I'd try and stay connected with the person that was in front of me that I was talking to, but there was a part of me that was entirely somewhere else, and then a small part of me that was still present. So sometimes people didn't realize, or sometimes they'd be like, oh, are you all right? And I'd be like, oh, I just remembered my mum. And, you know, but I remember that feeling of dropping. It was almost like I was dropping into the memory. Now it's a different feeling, because as time goes by, you're not so much, well, me personally, I'm not so much falling into those memories as kind of remembering them in a lighter way. So what I wanted to do was capture the way that I thought Nuri has lost so much. I lost my mum. He's lost everything apart from his wife. And even that, he's got a different version of his wife. So I thought, how does a man who's lost so much, how can I show how he would fall into those memories and just sort of be consumed by them? So I remembered that thing of like someone saying a word and me sort of falling into the memories. And I thought, well, why don't I experiment with that? So I remember with the first chapter experimenting with it, and the Moroccan man was holding the watch, which was bronze. And then I imagined Nuri sort of imagining the city as being bronze. So I thought, what if that word sort of throws him back? So I thought, let me try this. So I tried it and I thought, oh, that could work. And so I just felt, oh, maybe this is working. And I just continued with that. So that's how that came about.
Thank you so much.
You know, the American version plays that down a little bit. I think that's one of the beautiful parts of the book. Do you know what I'm talking about? Right? In the UK version of the book I read, for readers who haven't read the book, there are words that link the UK section back, and the words that link get their own page. Right? Can you see that? It gets its own page, and then this word connects to the next sentence on the next page. But the American version does it like this. Right, that's so different. I think there's a kind of performance to the reader that is unique to the first version I showed you, where you have that one word and there's all this white space around it, and it gets its own unique page, you know, which is kind of a beautiful aspect to the other publication.
I really like
going through.
No, go on, Victoria. That's fine.
I was going to say thank you for showing us that, because I, Natalie, not as smart as you are, it took me a while to figure it out. And then once I figured it out, I was like, oh, this is what's going on. And I wish I had a version that showed me that, because once I figured it out, I was like, oh, this is so beautiful and cool. And your explanation is so moving about your mom. But I would have loved to have that really shown to me so that I was in it earlier. And because I was like, almost like I got to go back now and weave all these pieces together, because I would have really loved to track that as the book unfolded. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
That's really interesting to hear. And I think what I really liked about the fact that they put it on an individual page was that it kind of highlighted the importance of what that word, or what it's like a smell, where you smell something, suddenly you're somewhere else. It can just, you know, it can be such a huge thing, but such a seemingly small thing. So I think I like the fact that they put it on its own page like that.
Victoria, it's funny to hear you say that, because I read this book for the first time as an advance copy before it was published, and it was sent to me as a PDF. And I thought it was a mistake. When I got to those words, I thought, oh, this PDF is corrupted. I need to email the people and tell them to send me the correct version. Because, you know, sometimes the advanced copy has the odd typo or grammatical error that hasn't been fixed yet and whatever. And that's what I thought. I went through like 30 minutes of reading this book thinking, oh, my PDF version's all messed up. And then I understood, you know, but I had the same response initially, which is kind of beautiful. I mean, I say that not as for the reader to have to catch up to something like that is part of the magic of the book. As a reader, you feel like you're learning the rhythms of the book as you go, and certain books operate that way, and it's really, you know, rewarding for a reader to have that experience, I think. Yeah, Amna.
Just on the same flow of things, I actually found the book really fascinating because I kind of traced 4 different timelines in there. You have like the timeline of the journey, then you have the timeline of what's happening in England, then you have the timeline of Mustafa and Nuri's childhood. Yeah. And then you have the hallucinations, which is kind of like another plane altogether.
Yeah.
So it was so beautiful. It was so fluid. I really admired the fluidity of it. You just flow from like one memory to the present, and then it was fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks.
Good, thank you. One kind of final, we'll start to wrap up here. One final point that I'd like to underscore that we've kind of indicated already is, as I see it, and Christy, I think you'd agree with this, but as I see it, this book in some ways it's about a married couple. As much as it is an immigration journey and it's all this stuff, and we talk about the headlines and these other things, but at its heart, this book is about a married couple who've been married for a number of years, and they've gone through something traumatic that has separated them in some ways. I mean, they still love each other, but they don't, and it's also about rebuilding that relationship. Anybody who's been in a long-term relationship would recognize the rhythms of Nuri and Afra, the two main characters of this book, and how in some ways it's a journey, a story of a married couple putting their relationship back together.
This is it. Yeah, that's entirely it, which is why I changed the structure, because I didn't want the reader to be, do they make it to the UK? I wanted it to be a story about a married couple. And I think in that way, it can kind of be about anyone that's displaced or that's suffered such trauma. And I guess that again came back to my own family history, where I saw, the effects that war can have on relationships, which is often something maybe we forget or we don't hear about in the news. We're not going to hear this married couple are having real difficulties in their relationships because of the war. We're never going to hear that on the news, but actually that's their life. And if their relationship breaks down, then that, and they've lost so much, I mean, that's devastating. So
you're making me think, in some ways, the book is about, yeah, exactly. How do we put our relationships back together after we've experienced something traumatic, monumentous? And I'm thinking now, as we're, I hope, on the tail end of COVID, as we do this interview, it's April of 2021 right now. And how do we put our lives back together after this year of living in shelter? How do our kids go back to school after a year and a half of not going to school? Like, how do you go back and achieve some sense of normalcy and love that you had before that traumatic thing? How do you do that?
no,
And it seems that's the question this book's asking in some ways.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And even after my mum died, I thought that me and my brother and my dad and my other brother would pull together, but somehow we isolated ourselves from each other. And then how do you find that, when you've lost something, or how do you find those people again? So yeah, that applies to the lockdown, that applies to a loss that we've had, because sometimes we think we're going to come together, and actually sometimes the people we need the most, we actually turn away from. Or like on the weekend, for example, I had this party to go to, which was an outdoor thing, because we're allowed to mix outdoors now. And someone was leaving. There was a couple that were leaving to go to New Zealand, and we were invited to go to this sort of outdoor thing. And it was the first time I had seen so many people around me, and I was completely overwhelmed. I thought that I didn't know how to speak to people anymore. And thank God I had my dog there, because I was like pretending to speak to the dog. But that's a very kind of mild version of what we're talking about. It's like, how do we go back to what we knew, and how do we connect with people again? And I found it so difficult until this woman came and stood next to me, and I said, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. And she said, oh, thank God it's not just me. And that was it. We started chatting. So I think there was that shared connection there. So I think it can apply to so many things. How do we rebuild, and how do we reconnect?
I think that's a great idea to end this conversation on. I mean, it's partly why the book, I suppose, has been so widely read, as it's not just an immigration journey, but it's other things too. It's this love story how we deal with trauma, how we put our lives back together after something has happened. It's an incredible book. And for anybody listening to this call, if you haven't read it, I wholeheartedly recommend The Beekeeper of Aleppo. Christy, thank you for taking the time to join us. It's been a real pleasure and honor to have you here.
No, thank you. It's been wonderful talking to you all, really.
Thank you.